All right. Welcome back, everybody, to our fifth installment in the Hayden White series, discussing the book Tropics of Discourse. In this part, we are discussing the fourth chapter, which was titled Historicism, History, and the Figurative Imagination. I like the way this chapter began. It began with the distinction between historicism and history, and maybe I can start by talking about that distinction a little bit. So we have historicism on the one hand, which it has an ism at the end, so that's a clue. The ism indicates that the study of history wants to be more, wants to be general, wants to bring us lessons that we can apply in the present. On the other hand, we have history, which is not historicism. History, distinguished from historicism, wants to pay attention to particularity, to singular cases, to events in history that we can pay attention to, and that attention would be beneficial for its own sake, not necessarily giving us lessons to apply in the present. And of course, Hayden White follows that distinction by saying that it is not a useful distinction, that it is doesn't correspond to how things are in reality, that history, a study of history and historiography always has those elements that we attach to historicism. So there's always in history, in study of history, that tendency that move towards becoming more than singular cases, becoming general and having this mythic flavor to it. So I'll pause there to continue the discussion with the next person, John.
Okay. So that he sort of makes a shift here in the way the essays are ordered, from talking about tropics and tropes to figurative language and rhetoric. That's what he did, but it's all kind of the same. When we think about figures of speech or figurative speech, we tend to think about poetry. When you ever take, say, a poetry class in high school or college, you're asked by your professor to locate a simile or a metaphor, locate a case of synecdoche and what that particular figure of speech is trying to do. But as we'll learn later, even in the simplest forms of prose, we have figurative language. Some of it might not seem figurative because the figurations in it are dead. That is, they no longer strike the reader as figurations at all. And we can cover that in a little bit too. But simple sayings like break a leg, that's a figure of speech, right? But when we hear that, we don't hear, please go fracture your femur in 3 places. We know that has a different meaning. And it's kind of that he's trying to get us to see in prose as well. We get this impression that prose is transparent, that you can just see right through it. It says what it says. The meaning is straight on the page, where poetry, like, there's some sort of hidden meaning, some sort of latent meaning. But he argues that there is that latent meaning in prose too. And he's especially interested in, of course, historiographical prose, but he would go so far as to say that it happens in all prose as well. Claude Lévi-Strauss made I think he mentions him and he compares him to Ranke, the German historian. And he says that Lévi-Strauss sort of outdoes Ranke by both of them see this impulse to mythologize via figurative language, but Ranke sees it in, quote, real or imagined interests of the social groups for which different kinds of historiography might be written, whereas Lévi-Strauss and Karl Mannheim, someone else he mentions once or twice in the essay, sees the impulse to mythologize rather in the nature of language itself, which goes back to the fact that it's not only in poetry, but also in prose. So it is this figuration, this tendency to talk beyond the literal, which sort of sprinkles historiographical prose, and as we might talk about a little bit later, creates a possibility for understanding in the reader.
Well, thank you, John. And Davood, it's always good to speak with you. He has this lovely line on page 107 where he says, language use serves as a code by which the reader is invited to assume a certain attitude toward the facts and the interpretation of them offered on the manifest level of the discourse. I really like that line. And it made me think about creative writing. We do a lot, my wife and I do a lot in that. And take these two sentences. So I would say, John ran to the mailbox. You go, okay, that's good. Then I would say, John ran to the mailbox quickly. Wait a minute, the word quickly has a kind of judgment in it. Who is deciding that they are running fast, right? Maybe they're just running. Who is deciding that it is quickly? You know, in creative writing, there's always this tension of adjectives and adverbs. You know, they'll warn in creative writing, you want to be careful before you use this, because a lot more language has judgments in the language that you don't even realize are there. Like if I were to say the Roman Empire collapsed, but let's say the Roman Empire ended. Okay, well, both seem to mean the same thing, but the word collapsed has a kind of judgment, right? You know, it's quick, it fell in a certain way, it was dramatic, right? But if I were to say, you know, the Roman Empire ended, well, it's much more, there's less judgment there, but actually maybe not. Because that would mean I'm not, if I were to say the Roman Empire ended in 395 AD, oh, well, you don't consider the Holy Roman Empire part of the Roman Empire? You know, you're saying the empire ended, why don't you include that? You know, so even in the word ended, there might be a judgment that is part of that, right? Or if I were to say, oh, the Confederacy lost the Civil War, you know, some people would hear that and say, well, they didn't lose because the spirit of the Confederacy lived on through Reconstruction, and it kept going. So, you know, that might be a silly example, but the point is that even in sentences that seem kind of self-evident in their meaning, there can be a certain judgment. And what's even crazier is if we go back to that first example where I was saying Mark ran to the mailbox, even if you don't include quickly, the word ran can even be a kind of judgment, because, you know, maybe Mark jogged to the mailbox. Maybe he just walked quickly. Even the word ran might entail some sort of judgment. And once you take this seriously in creative writing, you actually get kind of paranoid and crazy, because what are you supposed to do in creative writing? You're supposed to show, not to tell. So if I say Mark ran to the mailbox, am I telling you or am I showing you what Mark did? My favorite book on creative writing is by a man named Robert Olson Butler. He wrote a really good book called From Where Dreams Come. And what he was trying to point out is that even fiction writers, let alone historians, are often telling when they think they're showing, because they're using abstractions. The word ran is actually an abstraction. What Olson wants you to realize is that instead what the writer needs to do is say, Mark lifted his knees at a 45-degree angle and put his right foot in front of the left, and then moved the right as he right back in front as he chased after Sarah. Much longer sentence, but actually now you can kind of see it, right? And what Butler wants you to do is, like the fiction writer, if you want to get that movie in the head, you have to do a lot more description. But let me tell you, I have a novel, Turn the World, that was like 60,000 words. And I went back and tried to do this, and it's already at like 200,000 words. Like, it really expands it because it's so difficult to do. But if you really want to show instead of tell, that's what you kind of have to do. You have to really work very hard. And you can't do it all the time. Sometimes you do need to use the word run instead of describing the motions of the knees. And if you did that every time, it would get boring. But I will say that the very awareness of how many words have a judgment in them, or that are abstractions that therefore are empty and a judgment can be projected into them, the realization that a crazy amount of words have that going on really transforms how you think about writing. And I couldn't help but, while reading this essay by Mr. Wright, to be thinking about, Hayden White, to be thinking about that, where he's encouraging the historian, think about all the judgments that might be in these words. It doesn't seem like it's there. It seems like you're just making a statement of fact, but be aware of it. You can't avoid abstract language entirely, but at least if you're aware of it, you may do a better job of noticing when there's a judgment embedded in language that otherwise you wouldn't have even realized was there. It's a lesson that fiction writers need to learn, who crazily enough think they are showing. Like, that's the thing. Like, you'll think you are showing. And I go back and read old stories and it's like, oh my gosh, I thought I was showing, but actually I'm telling if I follow Mr. Butler. And then you rewrite them. It's really transformed things, let alone if you're in the field of history, well, you don't even accept the premise that what you're doing is some sort of literary genre, as we've talked about in previous conversations. So I think it's a big revelation, and yeah, it's pretty funny once you realize how many words, and then I'll pass it back to Davood, how many words actually have judgments that are in them that you don't think are judgments. It really transforms your relationship to language. And so I was thinking about that as reading this essay.
If I could just say one thing, that you're making a distinction there between showing and telling. I think Hayden White would say that in both showing and telling, you are creating judgments.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. Well, and so you're always, it's an imperfection. Like, to clarify, in Butler, there's always a kind of,
it's like, an aspect of language you can't avoid.
That's correct. But being conscious of it, you can do a better job of, you can do a better job at it, you know, but even knowing that you're ultimately trying to fail well, dare I say, that will transform your relationship to the text. So absolutely.
I think we could easily sort of slip into thinking like, you know, these figurative aspects of language are imperfections that we have to pick up. And it's not like it's an imperfection. It's something that, you know, comes with the nature of language and word use, you know, sort of how to do things with words. And when you do things with words, you figurate, you use figurative language.
Oh yeah, maybe the better term would be incomplete, you know, because imperfect kind of sound like it's incomplete. And I always think about a difference between around something, about something, and at something. And often we can't get at it, but we still need to be about it. And we don't want to be in the realm of just talking around it, because then we're not actually dealing with the subject, we're missing it. So this kind of accepting a incompleteness, that's probably a better word, John, as opposed to imperfect.
I think the distinction between showing and telling would map onto the distinction between facts and interpretation, or the Freudian reference that Hayden White includes here, the manifest level of an event, and the latent level, the interpretation. I think it would be helpful for us to imagine an instance of pure showing. So we have a description, but we don't know what this description means. I think that kind of example would make us aware of this habitual understanding, the habitual interpretation that always accompanies our.
Would that be something like a chronicle?
A chronicle.
He goes back to, he says a chronicle is just a list, a straight serialization of historical events, and that without commentary, that it is pure showing. You know, it's not, it's just this, then this, then there's no cause, there's no linking, there's no complexity. It's just a list, and that you need that sort of imaginative, figurative thing to actually tell.
There's no causality, and there's no causality through agency, because what historical accounts tend to reveal to us that is not just things happen and causes follow from actions, but that agencies, types of agencies are revealed through a historical account. That people did that. People made decisions and affected change. There was a comment in under our previous video, and the person said that they disagreed with Hayden White, and they said that the historians should stick to their own method of doing
research. Is that rainbow?
Yeah, rainbow sky. And I think that maybe we can spend a minute on this point. It is not that we are not saying, and Hayden White is not saying that that history is fiction and historians must rely on the methods of fiction writers. Instead, what the point is that there is a commonality between writers of fiction. There's a commonality in the method of fiction writers and the methods of historians, and that has something to do with the nature of language. That has something to do with the mind's need, or the mind's need to settle into a meaning. And there's a reason why, after hearing, for example, part of an event, let's say, for example, I say, I just had a big argument with my friend, and that's it. I don't tell you anything else. That is very clearly an incomplete scenario, an incomplete episode, and we need more information. We need more bits and pieces of that kind of episode to feel like we are settling into something like an understanding. So fiction writers are aware of that, they apply that, and historians similarly do something that is not even unique to writers of fiction. It is,
and if I know Rainbow's a big fan of Davood. But if Rainbow, if you're watching, I think what Hayden White is not saying that fiction writers choose to write in those genres that we talked about last time, like well, fiction writers might choose their genre, but when historians use this kind of I think the word he used in the last essay was embedded. It was, oh gosh, what was it? Embeddedness? Implottedness, yes. Yeah. It's not a conscious choice so much, but that it has to be there for us to appreciate the meaning making and the message that I guess the historian is trying to. We're forced to reconcile meaning with one of those various kinds of genres, I think is what he was trying to say in the last essay. And it might not be something historians actually say, okay, I'm going to use comedy to talk about the French Revolution, but it is one sort of mode in which you can do it. And again, we also talked about how, sometimes the mode chooses you through a process of indoctrination or education or whatever else. But yeah, it's not something that people choose when they write, but no matter what you're writing about it, you are indelibly drawn in by genre and its considerations.
Yeah, I can speak when you're writing that cover letter and you're sending it to the agents and you're supposed to tell them the genre that you're in. Oh, I hate that question. You're like, oh my gosh, the genre? And you almost feel like you're forced to put in a genre because otherwise they can't grasp it and they get all these different cover, these letters and different things. And so you want to praise it and be like, it's Southern Goth and you like Southern Goth, right?
It's a cross between Virginia Woolf and James Joyce.
That's what I should do, right? And they'll look and be like, okay, and they'll throw it in the bin. And they'll be like, where's Girl with the Dragon Tattoo? Number 50 or something. What's interesting too is I find, like, for example, if you have a story, one comes to mind where part of the idea is you have a character that gets something they've always wanted in life, but they don't have the eyes to see it. Right there, the moment you're trying to tell a story that centers around that idea, there is a sort of limiting or bracketing out of what kind of genres that the story can be in, right? It's not going to necessarily be a children's book, right? It may not be a summer romance or something that makes you feel good, like, I guess, what is it? Karen Hannah or something. There's something about that has a tragic element. Maybe it's funny, kind of in a tragic Kafka way, like a comedy. But the moment you're like, that's kind of the idea, or you have an image of where the characters end up that can be explained in terms of getting something you always wanted and not having the eyes to see it, because you're trying to make a distinction between, I think often we think that if we get truth, we'll also have the ability to know we have the truth. That's actually an assumption we have to be careful about. So the story is exploring that. The moment you do that, there is a bracketing out of the kind of genres you can be in. So similarly, the moment a historian picks a certain historical event, just by virtue of it having turned out the way it did, there's going to be a bracketing it out of the kind of genres they can be, considering that they pick X series of events to emphasize versus Y series of events to emphasize, or Z series of events to emphasize. If you want to focus in on the losing side of a given war, well, that's going to have a different flavor, describing those calls and events than the winning side of a war. Or if you want to focus in on a historical mystery that was solved, that will have a different flavor than a mystery that wasn't solved. And so, that right there, you can take. So for me, it makes a lot of sense what Hayden White is saying from trying to write story. When you try to do creative writing, it's quite clear that you don't pick the genre, even if the nature of the story brackets out the kind of genres you can be in. So there's a sense in which you pick the genres because you pick to be in this range of genres as opposed to this range of genres. But that narrowing in is a result of the kind of story you chose to tell, more so than choosing that range from the start. Now, there are different writers that do different things, and it depends on your objectives. If you know that summer romance is popular and you want to get your book published, you may do that. But generally speaking, I find when stories come to you where you're like, oh, you see the whole thing, it works more like that than the writing to the the popular press.
It is not just the type of story. I think the kind of stories that we tell, the types of implotment, they are always attached to worldviews as well. So there's a view of the world, and including in that a view of human nature. There's this example in this chapter of a book by Taylor about just a passage, a description of the Weimar Republic. And in that short passage analyzed by White, he shows that there's a view of human nature in a description of apparently a very fact-based description of the years of the Weimar Republic, and how long it took. Just the author is making a point about the duration, what years should count accurately to be the democratic phase of the Weimar Republic. And it doesn't take much work to realize that there's a very dark view of human nature, specifically the German people in that. So the implotment is pointing to, or it's attaching, it's like gesturing towards something like a worldview, something like the view of human nature. So would you agree with this? And for me, it is difficult to now come back to language and the nature of language, how language itself is moving us in the direction of implotment, in the direction of myth making, and if you agree, also in the direction of making worldviews and theories of human nature.
By the way, it would be interesting to talk about that passage. If anyone's interested in sort of seeing where the rubber meets the road and how all of this works out in a passage of history, he takes A.J.P. Taylor, a short little paragraph from him on, as Davood said, the history of the Weimar Republic, and says he chose it at random, but also because Taylor is known for being a very sort of matter-of-fact,
no nonsense,
unflowery, tell it like it is historian. And in fact, he is kind of known for that. And he chooses this kind of deliberately, but also randomly, he says, to show precisely what he's trying to show. The part of the essay where he actually fleshes out what that paragraph says is just 2 or 3 pages long. And we may want to talk about it, or, I would recommend, a lot of what we're talking about is the more theoretical aspects of the essay, but that perhaps is the most readable, because he breaks it down word by word, and he looks at the words. He looks at, in a couple of instances, their etymologies, but also the connotations and denotations that words have, just sort of psychologically, a collapse versus end, for example, those have very sort of, those impact your mind in very, very different ways. And when you string words together, you have sentences and paragraphs that impact your minds in very, very different ways. That's a very simplistic way of what he's trying to say.
And one of the words is the word ostensibly that he uses to emphasize that this is the appearance of democracy. It's this is the temporary part of the society and culture. The more stable, the latent content of culture is something else.
So I don't know, this might still be too full of sort of theory, but what he's trying to do by showing the Weimar example is, this is at the bottom of 105. It's the first full sentence. The theory of figures of speech permits us to track the historian in his encodation of a field of happening in what may appear to be only an original and value-free description. But we all know language isn't and can't be value-free. That's my input there. But which in reality is a prefiguration of the field that prepares us for the formal explanation or interpretation of it that he will subsequently offer. As thus conceived, the clue of the meaning of a given historical discourse is contained as much in the rhetoric of the description of the field as it is in the logic of whatever argument may be offered as its explanation. So that even before you start to build causal chains between historical events, you say this is related to this in such and such way, or this caused this, or this is important because of this, you still have to confront, before you confront the historical events, you have to confront language, because it is prior to anything else that you're doing.
No, that was one of my favorite sections, and one could wish for an entire book that took paragraphs and broke it down, because it really did. If I were to critique, I would I wish that almost would have been kind of at the beginning of the entire text, because then you have this study. It really brings it all out in the theory flow. So I completely agree with you, John. I would encourage everyone listening to this to find a copy to really get a grasp on what we're talking about, to find this essay, Historicism, History, and the Imagination, and find that section. It really brings it out, just like you mentioned it, where he says, only for 6 years did Germany lead a life ostensibly democratic, ostensibly pacifist. But in the eyes of many foreign observers, these 6 years appeared as normal, the true Germany from which the preceding centuries and the subsequent decade of German history were an abbreviation, where it's moving away from it. And right there, you get, now that you kind of know, to aberration. I don't know why I struggle on that word. Now that you know to look for judgments and terms, it's like obvious, right? Like it's all over the place.
It's like it's overflowing with judgments.
It's overflowing. And you see, I cannot express it. I really was having flashbacks to finishing Butler's book and then reading my own prose, and the horror. It was like someone had turned a light on, and I'm like, this is all telling. And I worked for years to make this showing, and I didn't even realize these terms were abstractions and full of judgments. I just wanted to show. Like you say, I think it's impossible to have a pure language, a language that's completely free of values. It almost would be like a pure science, or we can go on and on and on, a pure observation, pure things in themselves. We basically live in a world, it seems, where pure anything is impossible. I am a fan of dialectical thinking, although that term is so marred, where you go, okay, well, we can't have perfect language, but if we're at least aware that we can't, then we have to be active. And I guess, speaking personally, after Butler, I really do read sentences differently. Like, you look at them, you're really looking at them differently for judgments that you can replace with descriptions. Rather than saying Mark ran, I said, well, let me describe what Mark is doing. That if I describe well, the reader will see someone running without me saying he ran. And I could definitely see where, if historians did that, the text would certainly get closer to perhaps something that was less full of value judgments and different things. We don't want to chronicle, because that would be boring and no one would read it. And it actually would, in giving us pure facts, it actually wouldn't give us lessons, right? We wouldn't actually know how to apply it. And that's not good, because we do want to know kind of how people were motivated and what they were thinking, so that when we see people today motivated in certain ways or perceiving things in certain way, we can maybe learn from history. So we don't want a chronicle, but we also don't want historians saying, well, we can't do a chronicle, so who worries about, or telling themselves, and therefore letting subjectivity take over. But of course, we also don't want them thinking it's a science, because then they're not going to be thinking about these problems of values that are all over the page. But what does this all mean? Well, very active awareness about what you're writing, looking for these terms, brimming with judgments and values, and to try to fail better, I guess, as Cornel West says, right? To fail better, to fail better, or to be incomplete better. I brought fail back in when we were talking about imperfection earlier. So to do it. So yeah, it for me as a fiction writer, reading Butler just, and then I'll pass it back to Davood, it really did transform the text in front of you. And now you read stories that people present, and you see all of these mistakes. When I receive work and I edit it for people and send it back, and I could see we're having a similar light switch go off for historians, how that would be a positive thing.
Thank you, Daniel. Let's pause on this word for a moment, the word rhetoric. I used to be a little bit allergic to just the mention of rhetoric in science, in scientific writing, in technical writing. Every time somebody mentioned that, something is rhetorical, or should be more rhetorical, or should be, but rhetoric is in part is a movement towards, or it has the aim of changing our minds about something, an attempt to persuade. And one of the first things that rhetoric does, or persuasion does, coming from a text, one of the first steps is to persuade us that that text is worth reading, that it is not a waste of time, that is not completely meaningless, that we are spending time doing the reading. So that, I think, if a text is doing that directly or indirectly, that is rhetorical. That is the rhetorical dimension of the text, in addition to all the facts and information that it is giving us. And then, in addition to that, read me, the text is telling us it's worthwhile to read me. In addition, maybe I can also change your mind about some of the historical events of the past. So rhetoric is a movement. It is inseparable from, every time that we are having a meaningful reading experience, the rhetoric is at play.
Yeah, rhetoric is one of those words that, one of those many, many words, it seems, that has been infantilized by contemporary American usage. It's been narrowed to mean something negative, and so it's a particular kind of question, right? A rhetorical question is one that you ask but doesn't really get an answer or need an answer, and that has no connection to what the word rhetoric actually means at all. Rhetoric is simply a body of possibly figurative speech. That's what rhetoric is. It has its birth, back with the Greek sophists, and it's been a subject of conversation for the past 2,400, 2,500 years. So contemporary colloquial English usage of the word doesn't really appreciate the word's full historical context, which is a big problem.
Right. Yeah, rhetoric is not sophistry.
Yeah, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Though they did use rhetoric very well.
Sure.
But they're not synonymous, no.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what is it, Plato's Gorgias, or where they have the debate, is it better to be, to get people on your side or to find truth, that big debate on a politician or a philosopher. Rhetoric now, when people hear rhetoric, they hear manipulation, which is problematic.
Yes.
But there is, because, when we're talking about rhetoric to change people's minds, or it's more so rhetoric, what is the language, what is the rhetoric best that will help you think for your own sake, for your sake, not for my, and we may agree, but hopefully that's because we both agree at the point of truth, right? We both arrive, and that can sound idealistic, but it's a different orientation as opposed to, manipulation or control. Now, of course, if one uses rhetoric to help people see a truth that people over here disagree with, they may accuse it of being manipulation, but there certainly is a different way of thinking about rhetoric in a more positive light. I think this also brings to why it's to make clear, why does it matter to avoid language full of values? Why does it matter to describe Mark going to the mailbox as opposed to say Mark ran to the mailbox? Someone may hear all that and go, that seems unnecessarily difficult, right? Well, the reason is because if someone is reading your story and the movie of your story disappears from their head, which tends to do when you have abstract language as opposed to description, then they stop reading your story. They put it down because they're pulled out of the plot, right? So the danger of what Butler's trying to say is that if you're not aware of language that's abstract, you're going to interrupt the reading experience and they're not going to be completely pulled in. Similarly, if someone is reading your historical account and they have a sense of a certain value judgment, if they don't agree with you, well, they'll say, they'll put the book away, right? They'll stop reading it because they'll be taken out of the immersion in the historical information because they sense a certain bias, right? So they won't be changed. Or they won't at least, think in new ways. So there are very real, in terms of what you're talking about, Davood, there's real consequences for the historian not being aware of using this value-filled language. Because the problem for the fiction writer is when you write the sentence, Mark ran to the mailbox, you do have an image in your head. You see it, but that's the curse of knowledge. The person reading it won't have the same image you have in your head. So you have to do a lot more descriptive work that from your point of view is not needed because you see it. So likewise, the historian can see the account and they are almost by definition immersed in the historic episode because they care so much about it, because they've been in it for so long, that they can lose the ability to detect those judgments of which could alienate or turn off certain readers. So that's why it matters to be aware of this stuff, because, you got the question of, does it happen? And then why does it matter that it happens? And then, of course, to go back to one of our earlier conversations, if indeed every historical account must have a certain incompleteness, must have a certain dealing with this problem, but never completely overcoming it. Well, then we get, and that doesn't mean that therefore we don't read history at all. It means we read a lot of history, that we have a dialectic between different historical accounts, and we have a renaissance of history, not a negation of history. So the only way you're also going to have that, he ended the last essay talking about history being in a bad shape. Well, the only way to get that sort of resurrection is to accept this as an invitation to, it's basically saying to you, it's like, hey, you want to know about World War II? You have to read more than one book that, you know, Bill O'Reilly suggests or something. You need to read a lot of books about World War II and that have a dialectical relationship. And then hopefully each one of those historians will be doing their best to describe without having all those value judgments and therefore using rhetoric in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. I want to emphasize, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say the phenomenon that OG was talking about was having that curse of knowledge in your head, but not being able to exactly get it on the page because of, well, limits of space and time and everything else. Yeah. He refers to it as condensation.
Yes, he does.
Just in one or two places, he also refers to displacement, which I think is another rhetorical technique, which you can talk about sort of a chronicle as being, you know, serialized, but displacement is giving pride of place to certain events, people that may not have come in a particular chronological order. And he also talks about considerations of representability. That's in his section where it's you almost blink and you miss it. He talks about all of these techniques are also used when we engage in meaning making on a subconscious level, in dreaming, in the act of latent content making in dreams. So he's basically fleshing all of this out on a conscious level, what our brain does very naturally on its own while we're asleep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The reason why we tell instead of showing is because our mind, or in our mind, we have already organized, we have already given form, we have already given figure, we have figurated the content of our experience, the facts of our experience. And we just we share the products of that organization, we organize content, and we miss the matter. We don't share the matter with the person that we are talking with. One of my favorite books in psychology is related to this the topic. It's called More Examples, Less Theory by Michael Billick. And the point of that is that you should give examples and not just that, don't just talk about the organizing principles of the content that you're talking about. Share also what it is that is being organized, what it is that you are formalizing and organizing with the use of figures and rhetoric, what it is that you are using language to describe. You're trying, at least try to give a glimpse of that, what it is that you're attaching values to. And with that comes the possibility of the person, the reader, the audience, maybe imagining that this could be done differently. Or there's something behind it. There's a latent content or these appearances could be organized possibly in a different way.
Let me read one more quote that actually directly feeds into that. You said something could be different, right, than it actually appears. On page 111. Everyone grants that the historian must go beyond the serial organization of events to the determination of their coherency as a structure and assign different function values to the events and the classes of events to which they appear to belong. This task is usually conceived as that of finding the story or stories that are supposed to lie embedded within the welter of facts reported in a record or the diachronic series of events as arranged in the chronicle. Actually, however, nothing could be further from the truth. It's not found, it's created. And that's a distinction that, I mean, he talks about poesis and the poetic and the word, is it imaginative or imagination is in the title of the essay for a reason. It is so much of writing history, in particular, of course, what he's concerned with, but is poetic, has its origins in poesis and the sort of fonts of human creativity.
Great. That's a great place to stop this session. But any last words before we start? we stop. It occurred to me in the middle of our conversation that I forgot to introduce us. So maybe I can add this and then put it in the beginning. So I am Davood Gozli, and I'm with my friends John David and OG Rose, Daniel Garner. It's great to be here with you.
Great talk, everyone.
It was lovely. Really
Thank you.
enjoyed it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.